Herbert Hoover graduated from Stanford University. Then he and his wife went to China, where he worked as an engineer. During the Boxer Rebellion in June of 1900, the city of Tientsin came under heavy fire. Hoover directed the building of blockades or barricades, and on one occasion actually risked his life rescuing Chinese children. Hoover was a man that got things done. When Germany declared war on France, the American consul general asked his help in getting stranded tourists home. In 6 weeks, his committee helped 120,000 Americans return to the United States. Then he directed a program to feed the people of Belgium after it had been overrun by the German army. When the United States entered World War I, President Wilson appointed Hoover head of the Food Administration. He was responsible for getting food to our allies without creating shortages at home. Later, as a member of the Supreme Economic Council and head of the American Relief Administration, he organized shipments of food for the starving millions in Europe. After capably serving as Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, Hoover became the Republican presidential nominee in 1928. He said then, quote, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history in any land." Within months, the stock market crashed and America entered the Great Depression. Author Louise V. Armstrong, a relief administrator in rural northern Michigan, described her experience in We Too Are the People. She had voted for Franklin D. Roosevelt in the hope that he would do something to solve the nation's problems, but had no idea what he could do. She and her husband left Chicago for their assignment in Michigan. When the banks began to fail, she returned to Chicago to withdraw her own money, hoping that it was enough to sustain them until Roosevelt took charge. She wrote, quote, "The small sum of money we had in those banks was all that stood between us and the breadline. We figured it might last us a year if we counted the pennies and did not get sick. My husband had been unable to find employment. Our investments had become worthless. We could not have sold the house or rented it for enough to keep us. If we had lost what little cash we had, there was no one who would or could have paid our grocery bills or bought us coal against the blizzards. By Thursday of that week, we had done everything we could with our own affairs. Friday, there was nothing to do but watch. Watch the bottom drop out of the world we knew. We saw the city, at first hysterical, then stunned, prostrate. I do not know how it may have been in other places, but in Chicago, as we saw it, the city seemed to have died. On that Monday, I walked around the great shopping district. It was as deserted as it usually is on Sunday. The few people I saw seemed to be walking in a trance. There was something awful, abnormal, in the very stillness of those streets. I recall being startled by the clatter of a horse's hooves on the pavement as a mounted policeman rode past. Armstrong was more fortunate than most. She had savings to sustain her. The less fortunate, from every class and region, called on the federal government for help. Prior to his nomination for the presidency, Roosevelt spoke to a graduating class at Oglethorpe University. The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another, but above all, try something. He also called for a redistribution of the nation's wealth. In his inaugural address, March 4th, 1933, he inspired America. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. He offered few specifics, but once in office, Roosevelt began that bold experiment. He immediately called Congress back into session and declared a 4-day bank holiday. Some argued that he had overstepped his authority in closing the nation's banks and auditing their books. But afterwards, he declared that the banks allowed to reopen were reliable. On March 12th, he delivered the first of his fireside chats to explain the steps he had taken to stabilize the financial system. An estimated 60 million people huddled around their radios to hear the president speak. A stream of legislation poured through Congress during the first 100 days of the new administration. New programs and their governing agencies were created to address the specific problems faced by Americans.